Again, thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Religion in America, Exploring the Changing Landscape with Students. Our leader for this session is Timothy Beal, Florence Harkness, Professor of Religion, Department of Religious Studies, Case Western Reserve University. I also want to note that we're joined tonight by Amanda Oswald. Hello, Amanda. I see you in the chat. Um, Amanda's out of Frisco, Texas, but she's also a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. Amanda will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. Timothy Beal is Distinguished University Professor, Florence Harkness Professor of Religion, and the Director of the H Lab at Case Western Reserve University. He is also PI of Finite Futures, Imagining Alternative Ways Forward in the Anthropocene, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, co-PI of the Humanities and Leadership Learning Series, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon, and PI of a Responsible AI Curricular Design Project grant from the National Humanities Center. He was chair of the Department of Religious Studies from 2015 to 2021 and interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences in 2019. Earlier, he served as director and associate director of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities. Tim has 16 books, including When Time is Short, Finding Our Way in the Anthropocene, and the Book of Revelation, a biography, for which he won a Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Other books include The Rise and Fall of the Bible, The Unexpected History of an Accidental Book, Biblical Literacy, The Essential Bible Stories Everyone Needs to Know, Religion in America, A Very Short Introduction, Roadside Religion, In Search of the Sacred, the Strange, and the Substance of Faith, which was named one of Publishers Weekly's 10 Best Religion Books of 2005 and was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and Religion and Its Monsters. He is also the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Bible and the Arts, which was named the best print reference in the humanities for 2015 by Library Journal. Dr. Beal, it is indeed an honor to have you here with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. And I know that all the teachers, 300 plus teachers who are assembled in the room tonight, look forward to hearing from you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction, Mike, and thanks to Amanda for being our TA, and thanks as well to the National Humanities Center for inviting me to join you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I have to say that I'm having a little bit of an audio issue. I guess I sound fine, but what I'm hearing sounds sounds like the chipmunks. I took my AirPods out and I plugged them back in, and now everything sounds like the chipmunks. But I understand that I'm sounding okay, and Mike and I will interact through the chat, and he'll talk, and he'll also translate what he's saying in the chat, so I'll be able to follow the questions. Anyway, looking forward to this time with you all. A little bit more about me. I want to start with this. I got my start as a teacher doing a year-long internship my senior year in college in a public high school in Seattle. I was teaching English as a second language and required senior English to graduate. I have to say, I just have huge admiration for you. I couldn't do it. It was my greatest ideal to become a public high school teacher, and I developed all these nervous disorders and realized that I just wasn't going to be able to pull it off. So I just have gigantic respect and love for you all and respect for you all. After failing at that, I went back to graduate school in religious studies and ended up getting my PhD in religion with a focus on Hebrew scriptures, on Hebrew Bible. And so my way into our topic for tonight is through Bible. I tend to come at this whole field of religion in America through Bible. That is how biblical ideas, biblical texts, the idea of the Bible itself figures in American culture in different ways throughout history, so kind of cultural history of the Bible, if you will. And so some of the books I've written that are related to that, and Mike, I think, mentioned a few of these too, but of course, Religion in America, a very short introduction, which you have some excerpts from, and we'll be talking in relation to some of that material tonight. And then Roadside Religion, In Search of the Sacred, the Profane, the Sacred, the Strange, and the Substance of Faith, which was a kind of travel narrative where I took my family, my little kids, and my partner Clover on this road trip in a motor home where we drove around and visited these religious spectacles like the world's largest 10 Commandments and Golgotha Fun Park and recreations of the Holy Land at a 1 to 2 scale in Virginia, things like that, and wrote and thought about it. A book called The Book of Revelation, a biography, which is really a cultural history of the Book of Revelation. A lot of focus in that on apocalyptic culture in America. And then most recently, just a few months ago, When Time is Short, Finding Our Way in the Anthropocene, which is about how religion has contributed to our denial of death as a species, to the bed we have made for ourselves with regard to climate crisis, but also how religion might be a resource for breaking through that denial and finding hope on the horizon of what might be a finite human future. So that's a little bit about me. Our focus tonight, and we will take some breaks for back and forth and Q&A and Q&O, question and opinion. But our focus tonight is on the changing landscape of religion in America, and I'm hoping that we can pay special attention to younger generations, how they figure in that changing landscape, but also how we might engage with them, our students, with regard to this. And so key questions here, how is American culture changing? How is religion changing, and how are these changes in American culture and in religion related to one another? But also, always along the way, when we're talking about religion in America, we end up thinking a lot about the question, what is religion anyway? I think one thing that's clear when we are exploring these things is that religion is not some fixed, static, or timeless thing. Religion, which goes back to that Latin word relegere, to read, reread, or read again, is a dynamic, always changing process. It's about remaking inherited traditions, that is, beliefs and practices and institutions that make up religion, remaking those inherited traditions on new horizons of meaning. And so that's part of what we're paying attention to when we're looking at these changes. Just an overview of the talk tonight. First, we'll talk about some forces of change that are part of this changing religious landscape in America. The first three are related to the excerpt that I shared with you all from the very short introduction book. I want to update those and rethink those. That was quite a few years ago now when I published that back. And then ask what other forces of change should we be paying attention to? And I want to pay attention to one in particular, and I'll just let that be a surprise for now. And then after we do that, just a little bit about how we might explore some of this with our students. And you're the experts, but I'll share a couple ideas for discussion, a couple possible activities related to those discussions that might be interesting to experiment with in the classroom. Oh, before we dive in on the forces of change, just a quick footnote, because some of you, might be at least as interested in American religious history and teaching in a history context about that. That's not what we're doing in our discussion tonight exactly. We're more focusing on the changing landscape now and what the horizon of the future might look like. But for those of you who are interested in American religious history and teaching that, just a few resources, and I'll give you a second to screenshot this if you like, but I think that Mike also pulled the material off of this and is going to put it in the chat, so thank you, Mike, for doing that. But these are a few books related to American religious history. Ahlstrom's is a classic, and it's been updated as of 2004. Diana Eck's book, New Religious America, How a Christian Country Has Become the World's Most Religiously Diverse Nation. Really valuable book for thinking about religious pluralism and religious diversity and inclusion and equity and justice around those things. John Fee's book was America Founded as a Christian Nation. There's a new edition of that. Eddie Glaude, and he has been a presenter with the National Humanities Center. His book, Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, very powerful, very important book. Amanda Porterfield's book here is really more of a reader with a lot of primary sources for those of you who are interested in doing some work around those. And Al Raboteau's amazing book, American Prophets, 7 Religious Radicals and Their Struggle for Social and Political Justice, out just several years ago. The late Albert Raboteau, a great scholar of religion from Princeton University. This website provides a wonderful list of possible podcast experiences, episodes on a lot of different podcasts to listen to, and that might be an interesting way in for you and or some of your students. And then this video series called God in America, it's a PBS series, and I highly recommend that as well. So that's a little footnote. So moving into the forces of change, the first force of change that I would like to talk with you about is the rise of religious diversity, and related to that, the decline of Christianity in our population in the United States. And I put this book here again. I just mentioned it in the last slide, but Diana Eck's A New Religious America is a great resource for this. Thinking about this, even though it's a decade and a half old, I think, at this point. But one of the things that she really emphasizes that is important to keep in mind, a major factor in the rise of religious diversity is what many of you already are aware of, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. And this act abolished earlier quota systems based on national origin that restricted the number of different ethnic populations, national populations immigrating into the United States based on a kind of calculus of what were the original percentages of the early settlers in the United States. And so this created all kinds of restrictions. That was abolished in 1965. And since then, we've really seen just an explosion of diversity through immigration in the United States. So in the book, I talk about this quite a lot, and some of you probably had a chance to look at that. But the data I was using then, that book was published in 2008. I was using mid-decade projections from the U.S. Census and from the Pew Research Center, which does amazing, wonderful research on religious and religious identity in the United States. And so what I'd like to do with you around some of that is to kind of update that, to look at the 2020 census and the 2010 census and some of the newer work from Pew Research Center. But the main point, really what we come away with when we look at this stuff, is that we are seeing rapidly increasing ethnic diversity in the United States, and that this correlates with growing religious diversity. And when I'm talking about religious diversity, I want to include people who don't consider themselves religious, who don't self-identify as religious, including the group that we are coming to know as the nuns. You almost have to say the nons, so nobody thinks you're talking about a revival of, monastic movement among Catholic women. So, and at the same time, the declining number of Christians. So that's what we see in the big picture here. And I think one question that's interesting for us to think about, and I don't know about whether there's a good context in the classroom to talk about this. There might be. It depends on your context, I think. But, is a post-Christian America on the horizon? Is that what we're looking forward to? What might that mean? What might that look like? What sort of force of change would that be? I just want to sort of plant that question, and we can talk further about it if you're interested. So just looking at some of the data, some of the census data, and this updating, looking at the 2010 census and the 2020 census. From 2010 to 2020, we're looking at a growth in the total population in the United States from 309 million up to 341 million, so that's about a 7% increase. These are categories that are part of the census, so that's why I put quotes around them. You know, back in the book, I looked at that category of those who are foreign-born in the census, and at that time in 2004, there was about 10% of the total population were quote-unquote foreign-born, and that was doubled from the 1990 census. And now when we look at it today, in 2020, the number is 14%. So again, you know, made nearly 40% increase since then, so continuing to increase that number there. Those who identify as Hispanic, in 2000, it was about 31 million, which was up 38, almost 40% from 1990. In 2020, we're looking at 18.9% of the population, which, if I'm doing my math right, that's more like 62 million, and that's doubling that number since 2000. The Asian population, about 11 million in 2000, which was a growth of 43% since 1990, and in 2020, 6.1% of the total population, which I believe is about 20 million, and that's roughly doubled since the year 2000 or close to it. Those who identify as white, non-Hispanic, in 2001, you're looking at 69%, in 2010, 63.5% roughly, and 2020, under 60%. So you can see the general trends there. These numbers are, the trends I'd say are sharper when we look at younger populations. So you can see that in the little chart on the left, where you've got the total U.S. population numbers and the diversity there, and the numbers when you look at those under age 16 are just larger in all of those upper non-white sections of the chart. And this is just an important paragraph from that report. Most noteworthy is the increased diversity of the younger portion of the population. In 2019, for the first time, more than half of the nation's population of 16 identified as a racial or ethnic minority. Among this group, Latino and Hispanic and Black residents together comprise nearly 40% of the population. Given the greater projected growth of all non-white racial minority groups compared to whites, along with their younger age structure, the racial diversity of the nation that was already forecasted to flow upward from the younger to older age groups looks to be accelerating. So I think this is important for us to keep in mind, not only just in terms of the religious landscape in general and how it's changing, but also when we're thinking about working with younger people in our classrooms. So these census data numbers correlate with increasing religious diversity in general, and also with the decline of especially Protestant, those who identify as Protestant Christians within the United States. So you can see in these two pie charts, 2003, this is an ABC News poll with the Washington Post. All Christians in 2003, those who self-identified as Christian, 83%, and we're down to 72% in 2017. The other religions going from 4% to 5% doesn't look like a lot on a pie chart, but you know that's 25% or 20%. I am not a mathematician, but something like that, right? Over 20%. So that's significant as well. So we're looking at increasing religious diversity as well in the United States, and a decline in the number of those who identify as Christian. So the rise of the nuns, I think, is an important part of this changing religious landscape in the United States. Nuns, spelled N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, are those who self-identify with no particular religion. That is to say, they check the none box when they are asked about their own religious identity. These are largely younger people. They are an important part, I think, of our changing religious landscape. So if you look on the right, it's a hard chart to read, but what this is basically the data from the Pew Research Center correlating with the data from the General Social Survey about people who identify as Christian, people who identify as religiously unaffiliated, and people who identify with other religions. So across the top, you've got, I think, the Pew one, and that's those who, I'm not sure I'm getting that right. At any rate, one of them has the darker number, those who identify as, those who identify as Christian is going down quite rapidly. And that's same for the other survey. Likewise, those who are identifying as religiously unaffiliated in both surveys are going up quite rapidly. You know, not quite exponentially, but it's not even a straight curve. It's a shaped curve, so the increase is growing from year to year, and the number of those who identify with other religions is also going up. So again, important part of the changing religious landscape that we are talking about. And I think maybe this could be a good point for a break, Mike, and see what questions might be emerging, if any, or if not, then we can sort of keep cruising along.
Good deal. Thank you so much. And I'll read it out, but I'm going to drop it in the chat for you as well, our own presenter chat. But we have a question from Ricardo. Ricardo, thank you for including it in the audience chat, but also including it in the managed Q&A. But this is a question that came in pretty early on. As Christianity declines and secularism grows, is the church seeking to achieve at the ballot box what has not been able to accomplish in the pews?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. We could argue that for sure, right? Thank you, Ricardo, for that question. Yes, a kind of a desperation move potentially, if you want to think of it that way. But certainly, and I write about this quite a bit in the Religion in America book and in some other contexts, the rise of the religious right, beginning with, Falwell and the Christian Coalition and some of those folks back in the late 70s, really, oddly enough, tied to Ronald Reagan and in some ways in reaction to Jimmy Carter, who was a self-professed evangelical Christian, but we see that rise in some ways potentially continuing, right? And it doesn't necessarily correlate with the numbers of those who self-identify, and it doesn't necessarily need to. One of the things that we see when we look at the polling data as well is that you still have among people who are not necessarily practicing any kind of religion, Sunday to Sunday or anything like that, will often still hold certain sort of what we might think of as fundamentalist or conservative evangelical religious views, even views about the Bible, even when they actually demonstrate very little biblical literacy. They still have a very high view of the Bible. So that might be another piece of what's going on. But I think we can also ask whether there is not only something like a decline of Christianity and a growth of secularism, as Ricardo put it, but also whether Christianity might be changing. We're also seeing, even in some evangelical circles, younger generation Christians who are moving in much more of a progressive social justice direction, and their values are around things such as sexuality and some of those things which have been kind of hallmark ones. in the past are changing. So we may be seeing some changes on the horizon too in terms of what that looks like. But I hope that starts to get at the question. In a way, it's a hypothesis, Ricardo, but I think it's a legitimate one that we should continue to think about and watch, especially in the upcoming cycle of elections, right? Because evangelicals were such an important part of the support for Donald Trump in 2016, and we'll see whether that holds this time around.
Okay.
Let's see. I think.
Good deal. Thank you.
Here you go. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. We have one other question, and actually we had another to come in after that one. So, but this question is from Amanda. What advice would you give to those of us who live in areas or states that are passing legislation to squelch diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to creating a safe space for discussion of differing religions? Thank you, Amanda.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It's such an important question. We all need to be thinking about that and talking about that. And my heart goes out to those of you who are in contexts like that. I think about you every day. And what advice would you give to those of us who live in areas like that? It's such a struggle, and I guess honestly, I don't feel like I'm an authority on that. I feel like I want to be part of those conversations and part of that community work around how to protect and carve out alternative spaces, maybe in some cases for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and how that relates to curricular choices. It's definitely a hard-hitting question. I don't feel like I'm being hit by it, but I feel like I want to ask it myself, and I want to keep struggling with you all. Maybe there's an opportunity for something like the NHC to work with us to host those conversations.
Absolutely. And just looking at the audience chat and the responses, I think we'll start tonight. One thing I enjoy about this webinar series, we are currently at 347 people who are all weighing in on these topics from different perspectives. So everyone in the chat, continue to share your ideas on this. We have one other question for now, and it's from James. And James's question is, would you say there are still people who believe in a God but identify as not being religious? Is this more about the institution, about the church, rather than the faith?
Yeah, it's a good question. I didn't catch your name, but thanks, James. It's a great question, and it's an important question. It's one that I try to think a little bit about in the little piece from the Wall Street Journal that I shared with you all, because I said earlier, one of the things that we inevitably talk about when we're talking about religion in America is, what do we mean by religion? And one of the first things to say is that some religions don't have a god or gods. So already, if we're talking about religion and religious identity, we can talk about religions and religious identities that do not have any sort of notion of a god or gods, and also religion and religious identity that is not focused on belief. I think maybe because of our Christian-dominated culture in the United States and in Western culture generally, we tend to think about religion first and foremost in terms of belief. But for many religious people around the world, that's not the most important thing. It could well be, the rituals and practices more than beliefs, or more than being doctrinally orthodox or whatever like that. That's a very Protestant Christian way of thinking about religion. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. But I think you're also getting at religious identity that's not tied not only not tied to belief in a God, but also not tied to affiliation with any particular institution. And I think that's important to keep in mind too. We used to sort of say spiritual but not religious. You still sometimes hear that, but that word spiritual is almost problematic as the word religion. What we mean by that can mean so many different things. Only a few decades ago, what that meant was really pious in a Christian way, and now it can mean sort of non-institutionally affiliated and non-theologically or God affiliated religious identity. But certainly we're seeing that, and I'll talk a little bit more of that in relation to some of the other forces of change as well. But when we're looking at younger generations who call themselves nuns, who self-identify as non, oftentimes the kind of community work that they are part of, and the communities that they're part of, and the things that drive them and motivate them, I as a religious scholar, as a religious studies scholar, would call religious. They just aren't religious in that sort of narrower, very Christian influence understanding of what religion and religious identity is. So I talk in the article about, things like CrossFit groups, where the CrossFit instructor might actually do their wedding when they get married and things like that. Is that religious? Is that not religious? I think that's something for us to keep thinking about. Okay, so Mike says I should jump back into the presentation. So let's talk a little bit about force number 2, which I did talk about in the book, but certainly this has really, changed a lot since 2008. But that is to say, new and emerging technologies, how these are changing the American religious landscape and even changing religion in very profound ways. In the book, I use this phrase, digital network culture, which I still think is a good phrase. It comes from Manuel Castells, and I have a quote from him in his book, Rise of the Network Society. By digital network culture, he's talking about, on the one hand, the digital revolution, PCs and digitization, CDs and everything like that, moving from analog to digital, but then that combined with the networks and infrastructures that connect up things that are now digitized in ways that allow them to move around. And that's really been the case all the way since the early 90s with the emergence of the World Wide Web, and even before that with systems like Unix and so forth. But this quote, I think, is a good one. The growing integration between minds and machines, and I would actually say between bodies and machines, the growing integration between minds and machines is fundamentally altering the way we are born, we live, we learn, we work, we produce, we consume, we dream, we fight, and we die. I would say, and how we do religion as well. Impossible to overstate how profound these changes are. So just a few recent examples that weren't really even part of the horizon in the mid 2000s. The rise of social media. Facebook's only not even 20 years old yet. 2004. YouTube 2005. Twitter 2006. I forgot to check on Snapchat, but TikTok 2017. Right. So all fairly recent emergences. The emergence, especially more recently, of big data lakes, and all of the questions about data ethics and data justice that are beginning to emerge, and how our data, everything from our shopping patterns to our eye movements to our clicks on the internet to our medical information and so forth like that, is being absorbed into the next topic, machine learning and artificial intelligence, which uses machine learning methods, computational methods, to learn from all of this data and to generate models that sometimes we talk about in terms these days of artificial intelligence. All of this really took off in 2015, 2016, when the Google Brain Trust shared something called TensorFlow, which is a library of neural network-based machine learning tools that really led to an explosion of use of machine learning, unsupervised machine learning methods. The rise of robotics. And I have a good friend at Case Western Reserve University. He runs a program called Human Fusions, the Human Fusion Institute. I encourage you to look it up. And he's a robotics professor and scientist in the School of Engineering at my university. And the focus of Human Fusions Institute is on human-machine symbiosis, or human-machine co-evolution, harking back really to that Manuel Castells quote that I started with. And then we've got the emergence of extended reality, different technologies, and the metaverse that aspires to emerge from that. But everything from, HoloLens and Oculus, Facebook's virtual reality device, and lots of other devices like that either create completely alternative digital built environments for people to occupy, or create mixed reality environments where the digital built environment is interacting with the quote unquote real world and real bodies. And these are just a few examples, and who knows what will come next. By the way, this picture here, which I should have explained before because I'm looking at it thinking it's impossible to decipher what this is, but this is a group of students in my colleague Betsy Bolden's art history course, wearing HoloLens devices, Microsoft HoloLens devices, that allow them to see and interact with one another while they are in a virtual environment, a digitally built environment. And the environment that they are in is the Red Monastery, an early Christian monastery in Egypt that Professor Bolden and some others, some other tech people, created a model of, so that people right there in Cleveland, Ohio, can put on their HoloLens devices and wander around and even fly up to the ceiling and look at the art up in the ceiling of it as well. But one of the things that was interesting about this on the religion end was that they began to feel like they were in a sacred space when they were entering this virtual monastery with one another. And they actually developed a ritual practice for entering it and leaving it, where they would take their shoes off and they would sort of don a different sort of disposition as they entered into this space, because they felt that it was a kind of sacred space. Just gets your imagination going on what other possibilities might be out there. Some big questions that relate to new and emerging technology and how new and emerging technology will continue to radically transform religion and the American religious landscape. How will these new and emerging technologies change the American religious landscape? I just said that. And how will they change religion itself? This is something for us to keep thinking about. Marshall McLuhan famously said the medium is the message. And what he meant by message was not just sort of the content message of a medium, but rather he said the social effect. So the medium is the message. When you say that, you mean that media technology has a social effect. He could talk about a light bulb as a medium in that way, because it changed the way society was organized and the ways people related to one another. So if we think about the technology as the message in that way, the media technology is the message in that way, what kind of social effects will these technologies bring? And how will they change us in the ways we relate to one another in religious contexts and in other contexts? And a bigger, really maybe for many of us more vexing question related to that is, to what extent can we even control these changes? This is really a question of human agency and ethics. We might look at some of these technologies, like a lot of us are looking at ChatGPT these days and thinking, this is concerning. I'm concerned about, how we put some boundaries on this and how we kind of rein it in or control it. But a big question is, can we? What kind of control and agency do we have in relation to these technologies? Some scholars, philosophers of technology, historians of technology argue that technology actually has a life of its own, that we are, in some sense, we humans and other animals are co-evolving with technology, and that technology is in some sense an extension of the human, but also that the human is in some sense an extension of the technology. I don't want to get, you know, sci-fi horror on us here or whatever, but what does our agency look like in this context if we take these questions seriously? That's something for us to think about, I think, with our students as well. I think they get it as a real question. And it's related to the religious landscape. It's also related to culture more broadly. So those are some big questions related to forces of change related to technology. The third force of change that I'd like to talk a little bit about, just fairly briefly, and it's something that I also write about in the book, is consumer culture, and relatedly capitalism. I think some of us might just initially think, well, religion is completely separate from consumer culture, right? One is sort of sacred and set apart from that. But the truth is that that's never, ever been the case. Religion is always enmeshed in economic systems and cultural values, including consumerism. Just one example of that I've written about in a book called Rise and Fall of the Bible, where I look at the Bible business, the evangelical Bible business in particular. Here are a few examples of Bibles that have been for sale fairly recently. But in that culture, what we had is a kind of, since the 1940s and early 50s, we had this sort of marriage of capitalism and consumer culture and popular culture on the one hand with Christian evangelicalism, right? So that spreading the word, spreading the gospel, and moving product, selling things, really go hand in hand. This was something that began to emerge with the parachurch movement, like Young Life and Youth for Christ, and groups like that in the 1940s and 50s, and has continued to sort of explode, where, you know, it's about, in some sense, making Christianity popular. That's just one example. But we can think about other kinds of ways that consumer culture interacts with religion, and ways in which maybe religion gets commodified or monetized, or becomes a kind of an object of consumer desire in some way. And so we can think about religious identities as consumer choices that we all, you know, we hear about church shopping, for example. That's just a literal, unapologetic, explicit example of that. But I notice this a lot with my students, that they sort of think about their religious identity as something that they're going to kind of choose for themselves, and it has a certain reminiscence to other kinds of consumer choices. We can think about create your own hybrid mashup religions, and this kind of relates to Ricardo's question, I think, in some ways, that we live in a context now that our culture provides a context where it's possible to take bits and pieces from different religious traditions, whether as an individual or in a collective group, and kind of develop your own sort of religious community around those, with rituals and practices and institutions. And scholars of religion talk about new religious movements. It's such a popular field that we call them NRMs. So you hear religionists talk about NRMs, that's what they're talking about. But these new religious movements are often kind of hybrid mashups of other traditional religions that are combined together. And we can even ask whether consumerism itself is a kind of religious practice in our culture today. And relatedly, you know, we might ask whether the American context is especially amenable to these kinds of things because of its privileging of individual experience, of freedom of choice, and that sort of thing. In fact, that privileging of individual experience and of freedom of choice really has its own religious roots in Protestantism, especially the Wesleyan or Methodist tradition that really values the personal individual conscience and individual experience. And this certainly fed into, you know, the First Amendment and our doctrine of the separation of church and state, which privileged the individual conscience and resisted governments establishing any kind of religion. So another piece of this that we might think about is whether we could think of even capitalism as a kind of religion. There's a really great article that's several years old now by Harvey Cox called "The Market as God," and then he wrote a book with the same title. And this stained glass image here is from that book title. But a quote from Harvey Cox: "The market is becoming more like the Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, not just one superior deity contending with others, but the supreme deity, the only God, whose reign must now be universally accepted and who allows for no rivals." So capitalism, in this sense, has a kind of faith in infinite growth through extraction that is ordained and inspired by the market, who is this omnipresent, omniscient, authoritative God. Something to ponder and think about. So, other forces of change that if I were writing the book today, I might want to talk more about. I mean, certainly all of us are very much aware of our post-pandemic or maybe late pandemic society and how that is changing the American religious landscape, how that's changing how we teach about it, how that's changing our experiences as teachers and as students and as a society and as communities. That's something that I think is an important force of change that we could not have anticipated. Threats to democracy, um, social justice movements that are transforming religion, the rise of white Christian nationalism and conspiracy theories and these sorts of things. We could talk about all of these as forces of change that will certainly affect the future of religion in America in ways that maybe we cannot yet anticipate. But also, and perhaps especially, I'd like to draw our attention to another force of change, which would be my number 4, and that's climate crisis. I think that you probably, as teachers, share my experience that younger people are very acutely aware of this crisis, of the collapse perhaps that is on our horizon. They, I think they see it and experience it differently than older generations have. And in fact, the most recent book that I mentioned earlier, When Time is Short, very much inspired by my conversations with my students who are barely older than yours, right? And, you know, freshmen, sophomore, first, second year students, 18, 19, 20 years old. I teach a course called Religion and Ecology, and we focus a lot on this. And I've just been writing drafts of this book in conversation with them over the last few years. And this is from the introduction to that book, where I'm talking about younger people today. And I'm just going to read this. I believe younger people are also weary. I was talking about being weary with myself and my lack of ability to actually really act, you know, wholeheartedly. But I believe younger people are also weary. But there's a weariness infused with frustration, even rage, sick and tired. This is what I've learned from my college students and from my own kids who are now young adults. They have grown up fully aware and terrified of the ecological crisis they find themselves in. For many of them, climate anxiety, and climate trauma are part of everyday life. They have heard the deadlines come and go for the point at which it will be too late to reverse or even significantly slow global warming. They have heard leader after leader of every political and religious stripe promise to address it and then fail to do so. They do not easily imagine or anticipate grandchildren, let alone great-grandchildren, as my generation and earlier ones did. Indeed, many of them cannot imagine having children. Have that conversation with more and more of my students, and I'm deeply moved and affected by this. I think they are changing, you know, my perspective and making it really encouraging me and inspiring me to think more about how this is connected to religion and connected to the changing religious landscape and to the world that they will inherit. And I think there are some resonances actually between some religious communities on the one hand and younger people and their experiences like this on the other hand. On the one hand, we know this, and we could talk extensively about this, how religion and especially Christianity has in many ways inspired our faith in human exceptionalism and thus has fueled our denial of potential climate collapse to the point that it may be too late to avoid it. On the other hand, religion has resources and models of community that could help us break through that denial and find hope on the horizon of a finite human future. This is what I'm finding when I'm going and talking about my book with folks, especially on the progressive, Christian or Christian adjacent side of religious communities, that they see these religious spaces that they occupy as places to kind of create space for grief and for lament and for really facing what mainstream culture sometimes feels like it's denying, and for breaking through that kind of shallow optimism to try to do something that's more deeply hopeful around justice and around climate activism, but also around, facing what we're already going to see coming. And so here I feel like we may find resonances between the interests and passions of younger people on the one hand and those of some religious communities. I think both are seeking to break through that denial and to break through that kind of shallow optimism that, we just saw get punched in the gut again yesterday with the decision to drill in my home country of Alaska, to break through that denial and shallow optimism that so often dominates our mainstream culture, and to have deeper conversations. I think that's what younger people are hungry for, and I think that some in religious communities are also wanting to create space for that. I think I'll take another little break here and see if there are more questions, and I'd just like to share a couple ideas for what we might do in the classroom, and this is just me thinking with you. But so I'll take a little stop there, Mike, if you got any ideas, any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. And again, the chat is very active tonight. And so
Awesome.
if very, very active tonight. So if there are any questions, please bring them to the front via our Q&A. I will say pretty early on, just looking through the chat, there was a question that about your correlating data on religion, and a question as to the only group that didn't change over time was the Catholics group, which remained the same at 22%. Yeah. I don't know if you spoke to that earlier, but care to opine as to the reason for that change and maybe compare it to where we stand today as far as Catholics and that number?
I think I heard that, Mike. You still sound like the chipmunks, but it was about the Catholic numbers staying roughly the same while others are changing. And you might have also noticed that the other kinds of Christian identity, I believe, went up a little, whereas it's especially the Protestant population that has declined the most. We'll see. We'll see what happens with that. Catholic religious self-identity, back to Ricardo's question, is actually tied for many Catholics more to religious practice than to religious beliefs. It's about going to Mass. It's about maybe even just going to Mass on Easter and Christmas. There is more of for many Roman Catholics, there is more of a kind of family identity tied to Catholicism, whereas, again, back to that early American Protestant value on the individual conscience and individual choice and freedom of religious expression, that could be part of it. So it's a good question why it's remained unchanged. But overall, if we were to look at not from 2003 to 2017, we do see a decline, and I just don't have those numbers in front of me right at this moment. But I think if we were to go and look, and maybe this is just an encouragement for you to go and check out Q Research Center site, because they've got data going a lot further back from there that might help us see the larger trends. You certainly have some decrease, but it's not as great as among Protestants. I think that's a really good point.
Good deal. And again, apologies as to the audio connection there. We're going to move ahead. I'll put additional questions in the chat for you as well.
Great. So I think I heard that we'll dive back into the presentation, and then we'll have some time at the end to go further. Is that right? Yes. Okay. We can move ahead. Thanks, Mike. Great. I'm really sorry about this. I'm sure it's my fault, and it's very surreal. I have to tell you. Anyway. All right. So back to where we were. Just to think about how we can explore this with students, and I understand, especially for those of you in a public school context, you have to be careful how you do this, right? It's about, I like to say, and I teach actually in a secular university, in a non-religious university. I teach the study of religion there, so it's very similar. It's very parallel to what might happen in a public school classroom as well. But sometimes they'll say, we study it, we don't do it, or we don't do it, but we study people who do it. We don't talk about God, but we study people who talk about God. Something like that is one way of thinking about the difference. But I just have a couple suggested discussions and activities, really two pairs of discussion plus activity to suggest to you, and then if we have time, I might share a third that was a little more complicated. But these are really just suggestions. You all are the experts. You know, I had my 1 year in high school teaching high school that didn't go perfectly well. So I feel humble to be talking with you about these things. But one possible idea that I think would work well and has the added value for you as teachers of students getting some experience reading and interpreting data and talking about it. So the discussion would be just to simply go to some of the survey data that I've been sharing, and this is all readily available online. So look together, with it up on the screen, at some of the data from the United States Census and/or the Pew Research Center. Put a graph on the board and try to read it together. Read their reports and also the interpretations. There are articles that try to sort of suss out important points that they think are there in that data, and invite students to interpret it. Invite students to interpret the data and to look at the surveys themselves for themselves. Because it's not just, when you're looking at the data in those charts, you're just looking at the answers. But it's important to look at how the questions were asked, how they were worded, how they might be leading to certain outcomes or looking for certain things, and whether students might actually want to look for different things or might suspect they're leading in a certain way. But at any rate, what do the experts say that these data mean? And do you as students agree? What were the questions that were being asked, and how did they word those questions? So important when we're talking about religion and religious identity. How do such questions, such choices by the survey askers, survey creators, how such choices and wording shape the results? How could they have asked their questions differently, and what might that have changed with regard to the data results? What other questions should they be asking, and so on? Just have that kind of open discussion to really kind of, if you will, just get under the hood of that data and look at the survey and see what's driving it and how that is shaping the process in important ways. Just that, I think that kind of discussion can be really valuable and powerful and very empowering, I think, too, for for students, because they might feel a little bit overwhelmed when you first look at a chart like that and the numbers and feel like, I don't know how this works. But you can start looking more closely at it, and very quickly they'll find some toeholds in it, and they'll start to feel empowered to read it for themselves. And I think that's just such a valuable, empowering thing. And then as an activity, why not invite students to create their own survey? I've done this with my undergraduate students. Have students to work together to create their own survey, to study a religious landscape of some kind, whether the religious landscape of America. They could even do one that surveys people their own age, or they could survey a school if that were allowed. Might want to be careful with that one, or whatever. But just create the survey, whether you actually implement it or not. What do they want to know? What questions would help them find answers to what they want to know? How would they word those questions? How would the survey be administered? What would be the method for getting it out there, and all of those kinds of things? So a constructive process that gets you thinking again about what surveys are, how they're constructed, what the data that results from them is, how it is constructed, and could be constructed differently. I think there's some real value in thinking about an activity like that, or something else similar to that. My second idea, I imagine some of you are already doing some work with speculative fiction, with Afrofuturism, with the world of science fiction that's emerging, especially among young authors. A couple examples there. One that I am particularly influenced by and in love with is Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. But also, which is the story of a young Black woman in the year 2024 in a post-apocalyptic world in many ways, in which climate crisis and war and the end of democracy and rise of capitalism and so forth have really created this dystopian world, and the main character Lauren is really trying to sort of move toward transformational change and work within these broken systems toward greater justice, toward transformational justice, toward hope. And part of what she does is she's really sort of creating her own religion from inherited traditions. It's called Earthseed, and it's this scripture that she's writing. And her father is a Baptist minister, and some of it is influenced by that, and some of it's coming from other places. It's a great way to talk about religion as a process of remaking and reinterpreting inherited traditions on new horizons. There's a collection of shorter literature by the magazine Grist, which is an environmental magazine that's for working with young people, called Afterglow, a graphic novel that's fascinating, Ancestor, and then a graphic novel version of Parable of the Sower. Anyway, thinking about speculative fiction, and again, this is all about your context. Parable of the Sower is pretty intense and pretty heavy, and could be triggering depending on your context and your age and so forth. But assign or read and listen together to a work of speculative fiction, something aimed at the right age group, the right audience level, and have a discussion about what kind of future is being imagined here, and how does religion figure into it? How does this speculative future imagine the present forces of change shaping that future? What other unanticipated forces of change turn out to be especially powerful in this narrative, and so forth like that? So really an open-ended discussion that could bring in things like climate and technology in conversation with religion and into a discussion that's appropriate to the age level of your students in your classroom. An activity that might go along with that would be something like creating your own speculative fiction, whether in groups or as individuals, like storybook your own vision of the future that includes religion. So what's the larger vision? What's this world look like, and what does religion look like in that world? How have present and unanticipated forces helped to shape this world and its religious beliefs and practices and institutions? I think this could be really fun, and it gets people thinking about religion in a dynamic way in the context of the forces of change that are all around us, and trying to imagine how those forces might continue to change our world as we go forward. So that's another idea. The other one that I would have shared would be a kind of create your own religion exercise, where you might have, and I do this with undergraduates as well, where you have them sort of create a religion, maybe building it from other traditions or from scratch, and to think about what are the beliefs, what are the practices, rituals, and what are the institutions of that religion, and then have the students share these made-up religions, these speculative religions, if you will, with one another. And out of that, you can have a discussion that gets really deep and interesting about what we mean by religion, because there will be very different operative theories of religion, or definitions of religion, working in these different created religions. And it's a way to think about all of the different ways that we think about what religion is and what religion can be. So that's just another thought. And I will open it up for discussions and say thank you. But I'm still here, and looks like we've got about 10 minutes, so that's great. Yeah, Joy, it's really fun to do, and it's something I see that James has also done for. It's a very useful and generative exercise.
Good deal. Thank you so much.
Okay, Mike,
Good deal. I will continue to correspond with you in the presenter chat with my questions. And so, again, thank you so much. One of the questions that we have speaks to the reference you made to progressive social justice and how it's impacted the religious landscape today. How is the issue of race in America impacting that same religious landscape, considering that the church remains one of the most segregated institutions, particularly in the South?
Yeah, good question. So how is the, I'm reading your question as well, because I missed the first. Mention the impact of progressive social justice on Christianity, yes, and the issue of race in America impacting the religious landscape today, considering that the church remains one of the most segregated institutes, particularly in the South. Absolutely. And well, it's such a rich question. There are so many ways of approaching it, and also, I think we cannot talk about Christianity in the singular, especially when we're thinking about race and social justice, and also gender and sexual politics in religion in America. We really need to talk about Christianities in the plural. I happen to self-identify as Christian. I'm married to a Presbyterian minister. It is a very progressive, left-leaning, very pro-LGBTQ, social justice, anti-racism oriented church community. And when I look at, some other versions of Christianity that are out there, I think that's not the same religion. We're not even in the same religion, right? And so, thinking about Christianities in the plural is part of what we need to talk about here. Some of my friends and colleagues who are African American and who identify with Christianity and with and are part of particular congregations will also talk about, honestly, not necessarily wanting to become I'm not sure to become desegregated. I don't think that's the right way to put it, but you know what I mean. They want this to be a safe place for Black Christian community to happen, and I think that's completely legitimate and an important dimension of this whole dynamic. But when we look at the variety of Christianities that are out there, we see such a huge range of of racist and anti-racist work happening both consciously and explicitly, and unconsciously and unexplicitly, subconsciously, in different Christian communities specifically, certainly we will continue to see that impacting the religious landscape of America going forward, in ways that we will probably not be able to characterize in any sort of broad sweeping general way, if that starts to answer that question. But there's so much to it. I would strongly encourage you reading the Eddie Glaude book that's mentioned there, as well as another by Jim Wallace, who is the founder of the Sojourner community, called what is it called? America's Original Sin, I think is what it's called, which is racism, white racism.
Good deal, and thank you so much, and thanks to the audience tonight, everyone who joined us, just for taking the time out. As I review the audience chat, I'm seeing the thank yous throughout, and everyone who is here. We appreciate you all. Again, thank you, Dr. Beal, for just leading us and sharing your expertise with us. Special shout out to Amanda Oswalt for your service on the TAC, as well as your presence and contributions to the chat tonight. I'd encourage you all to keep up with what's going on at the National Humanities Center via our social media feeds to get updates on our activities. I'd also invite you to check out our next webinar, which is scheduled for March 16th, same time, 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. And that's with Jordan E. Taylor, who is an independent scholar. But the subject will be fake news and media literacy during the American Revolution, which I'm sure you all will enjoy. As I've said before, I am truly appreciative and thankful for you all, for all that you are doing in your respective communities around this country. I hope that your week continues to go well. If we can ever assist you all in that great work that you're doing, please do not hesitate to reach out. And I see your message there, Jeremy. Thank you so much, and we look forward to having you back. All right, have a great week, you all.
Lord, I kneel and offer you my When I'm trying hard to minimize your scheme of things, it's safer than a strange land, but I still care for myself, and I don't care.